My name is Ytasha Womack. I am here to be in discussion with the great Sheree Renée Thomas, all around fabulous editor and a person who played a very critical role in bringing W.E.B. Du Bois's The Comet into the sci-fi Afrofuturist lexicon. This discussion that we're having is in celebration and running in tandem with Tim Fielder's adaptation of W.E.B. Du Bois's work, The Comet. And before I ask Sheree all the great questions of the world, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. You should, of course, know who she is, but in case you don't, here's your opportunity to immerse yourself. She's an award-winning fiction writer, poet, and multiple Hugo Award-nominated editor. Her work is inspired by myth and folklore, natural science, and the Mississippi Delta Conjure. She's earned her fiction fellowships at Malay Colony of the Arts, Breadloaf Environmental, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, Tennessee Arts Commission, the Lucille Geyer, thank you. Lakes Writer in Residence Fellowship at Smith College, and poetry fellowships from the New York Foundation of the Arts and Cave Canem Foundation, among others. The author of 3 fiction collections, including 9 Bar Blues, Stories from an Ancient Future, Sleeping Under the Tree of Life, and Shotgun Lullabies. Sheree is a 3-time World Fantasy Award-winning editor for Africa Risen, which I happen to have a short story in, but we can talk about that on another date. And the Dark Matter speculative fiction anthology, which we're going to go into some depth about. She's the editor of the magazine A Fantasy of Science Fiction and associate editor of Obsidian. She's collaborated with Janelle Monáe for the Time Box altered novelette in the Memory Librarium and Other Stories of Dirty Computer, which of course was a New York Times bestseller. And Sheree is also a Marvel writer, as am I. And she's written the book Black Panther's Rage as a novel. So adapting that comic series into a novel, which we should do a discussion about that one day as well, actually, Sheree. And her comic book debut, The World Is Not Ready, featuring Black Panther and Storm, appears in Marvel Voices Legends, which is out now. I actually have a copy. I'm very excited about it. She lives in her hometown of Memphis, which means that she's basically near a mighty river and a pyramid. Welcome, everyone, to the world of Sheree Renée Thomas. Hey there, Sheree.
Friend, how you doing?
I am awesome. So glad to be in conversation with you. Sheree and I talk all the time, but this time we get to have a discussion and share it with all of you. And as I mentioned, we are having a conversation about the short story, The Comet, which was featured in Sheree Renée Thomas's anthology, Dark Matter. And what makes this appearance of this piece by W.E.B. Du Bois so significant is that until Sheree put this particular story in this anthology, I want to say no one, but I'll just say next to no one thought of that particular short story as being a science fiction piece. It is now a seminal work. That's often referenced when we talk about Afrofuturism. And we, as we mentioned, Tim Fielder, the stellar graphic novelist, is adapting this short story into a graphic novel. So, Sheree, can you tell us just a little bit about how you came across The Comet and then ultimately came to include it in this anthology, which came out, was it 98, 99?
Came out in 2000. I started editing in 1998. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So we all know W. Du Bois, obviously, from his innovation of creating the sociology field, right? With his groundbreaking study he did on the men of Philadelphia, right? And we know him from The Souls of Black Folk, right? Which is how I was first introduced to his work. We also know him as an activist who is co-founder of the NAACP and just so important in so many other parts of our story as a civil rights story in America in particular, right? And I had his stories and his poems and his romance and his prayers that are collected in the dark water Voices Within the Well collection already as part of my personal library. So I read it at some point in college when I would have read The Souls of Black Folk. When I also read the work of Octavia Butler, Kindred. And when I started thinking about working on what was at the time unnamed, the collection of Black speculative fiction, Dark Matters, a century of Black speculative fiction. One, I didn't know it was a century worth, like 165 plus years, right, of Black speculative writing in English alone. And I didn't necessarily think about, obviously, W. Du Bois initially. I started looking on my personal shelves because I realized that part of the conversation that we were having in the publishing industry was mostly focused on our pioneers, of course, which we know of as Samuel R. Delany, who's still writing, creating wonderful work to this day, the late Octavia E. Butler, and then the other people that, if anyone knew any other people, it might have been Stephen Barnes. They might have thought about Jewel Gomez, of course, from her wonderful creative work she did with the Gilda stories and offering us another perspective of vampirism that is one in which the vampires add something to the lives of the people that they partake blood, they take blood from versus just sapping them dry, right? So it was a very different perspective. It was rooted in Black liberation, where you have a Black woman fleeing slavery, and coming into this other life to get another kind of freedom, right? So depending on who you ask, you're gonna get different people. Later, it might have been Tanana Rifdu, who's an amazing writer in Afrofuturism and in horror, and also nonfiction, who comes from an activist family herself. So we have lots of different people that you could have looked at. Charles R. Saunders, who's doing what he described as Sword and Soul, right? Works taking the Conan the Barbarian or the Tarzan character and taking it back to the actual roots of indigenous Africans, right? Having their own adventures of being heroes in their own stories and having Black women warriors be a part of those adventures as well. So there are lots of different places you can go. But the conversation was that we being Black people didn't read or write science fiction very much, and that we weren't a part of the bottom line.
And that was the assumption at the time.
Yeah, that was the assumption at the time. Like, we weren't there. We certainly were barely in the publishing industry. Of course, Walter Mosley and others were trying to change that with the Pen Open Book Committee, which I was a part of initially, and other groups were working to try to change that at the time. But yeah, there was an assumption. And we have wonderful groups like the Carl Brandon Society, which is based on a fictional Black science fiction fan, Carl Brandon, which they, wrote newsletters and things and reviews and things from his point of view. And now it's an organization that gives out the Octavia E. Butler Award, the Kindred and Parallax Awards to support not only future Black science fiction writing and fantasy writing, but also to support writers of all backgrounds who are expanding our ideals of race in our genre. So a lot of great things. So my project was initially to create this gigantic wish list of stories that I was already kind of familiar with, of writers I already knew who were writing work that I saw as speculative fiction. I saw as science fiction and fantasy, and that often wasn't discussed as such because it's in the literary camp, right? In our industry, not our industry in science fiction, but the larger arts industry tends to cherry pick the works out of science fiction and decide that this work is a classic, this work is a classic, and they kind of try to divorce it from its science fiction roots, right? And you can think of H.G. Wells, or you can think of George Orwell's 1984, or you can think of some of Ursula K. Le Guin's work, or what have you. Even The Handmaid's Tale, right? It's often discussed as if it's not a part of the science fiction genre. And these works are very classic science fiction fantasy works. So that's what I was thinking of. I was looking at Gloria Naylor's work, Mama Day. I was looking at the writing of Alice Walker. I was
Right.
thinking of
And a lot of that work was sort of categorized as maybe magical realism, or they weren't using the term Afro surreal, but it had a sort of surreal, ghost haunting, multi-dimensional Africanist philosophical backdrop, very hoodoo-ish. And today we could talk about a lot of that in the context of Afrofuturism. Um, but at that point, you were working with the term Afrofuturism because you were one of the early adopters of using the term. But a lot of people still weren't really looking at science fiction outside of how it was defined by, say, largely white male culture in the West. And so you adding that particular story, it was a real milestone. And I'm wondering, when you first read that story, did you think of it as science fiction? I mean, did it hit you that way, or?
absolutely. I mean, I'm not really shy anymore. I used to be really quiet for a couple of decades, I think, about talking about it. And then I saw people doing PhDs on it and writing papers. I was like, wait a minute. I introduced this as science fiction initially, and also introduced the idea that someone someday should also study Ralph Ellison's work, The Invisible Man, and look at it as well in terms of what it can tell us more about the genre. But it's classic science fiction. You can't get any more science fiction than The Comet. It is a story in which it's a post-apocalyptic story in which a comet from space comes and destroys most of humanity, right? And only Jim Davis, who's an African-American man, and Julia, who's a white woman, think that they're the last people alive. They think they're the last people alive on the planet. Many other writers have written similar stories like this. There's no question about it being science fiction. And even if I use the traditional concept of science fiction is a story where you take the science fiction element out of it and you don't have a story anymore, then it's not science fiction. But if you, if you take the science fiction out of it and the story falls apart, there's no story, right? It's so important that that science fiction element is in there that you can't tell the story without it. That's science fiction. And the comet doesn't exist without the comet coming and destroying.
Yes, and I think what makes it quite a celebrated piece is that it's, the narrative of a comet destroying the world is usually seen as a dystopian moment. But for the main character, it suddenly becomes this opportunity to live a life he couldn't live before, which is essentially that of a free Black African American man roaming around New York City.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. And I think it comes right out of the imagination of the W.E. Du Bois because of his own unique path in life. And I was thinking about what would make him write a story like this. It seems like it works hand in hand with the research he was already doing, right? As a social scientist, and the observations he was making about race and class in America and the political legacies of slavery, right? And if you go back and you think about his childhood in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, for the most part, he had a pretty comfortable childhood initially and seemed like he and his mother were well loved in the community. He didn't have his father's input or guidance, but he had his mother and he had all the other people in the community who really loved them, right? And they are still, he's still celebrated, obviously, in Great Barrington to this day. But when I was looking into his biography and the writings that he had about his own life, his first experience with racism was when he was a child. He used to play, effortlessly with his white neighbors and friends and was welcomed everywhere. But then there was one little girl, I think, that when they went to visit everyone or received a calling card to come back to visit her, except for him. And the only common denominator, the thing that he recognized as a young person, as you do, if you're young and observant, was that suddenly his race, his color was the problem. And it had not been for him as a child before. And I think that was a formative experience that really changed his life path as a young person, because he immersed himself in the world of books like so many lifelong readers did. The library became a haven for him, and he read everything he could. So if that's part of your background as a young person, and you're thinking about how race as a child impacted your social development and how you perceived yourself, I'm unsurprised that he would go on to become such a very, eloquent and thoughtful thinker about how race and class affects us as Black people in America, the promises that the country has yet to honor, right? And looking into the souls of Black folk, right? And creating a story that examines how possibly freeing life could be without that centuries-long legacy of colonialism and slavery, the peculiar institution that it is, right?
Yeah. I mean, when I think
story, because I'm like, well, where's the Black woman? that was my question.
Yes, well,
in the story, it's just Jim and Julia initially, and then of course, their Eden-like experience in this kind of apocalyptic dystopian setting where they are theoretically free from their racial roles in society. They can just be humans and relate to each other as humans and help each other survive. Certainly that is completely changed once they realize that they aren't the last people to survive, and that they're white men who have survived. And that, of course, that means that the old racial structure and hierarchy, the apartheid system, is going to remain,
Yeah.
And Julie going back over there.
Yeah, it was a fascinating story. And I think that, when I think about W.B. Du Bois, I think about him as being someone who is really living a kind of life that a lot of Black people in America were not living at that time. He was, coming of age, 1890s, turn of the century, early 1900s. He was a student at Fisk, but then he also was a graduate of Harvard. He went to school in Germany. Even
though they didn't let him graduate in Germany, ironically enough.
Right. Well, he took as many classes as he could. He
went back and celebrated. They had a celebration in Berlin of the 150th anniversary of him not graduating. I don't know. It was very odd, but it was where he introduced his sociological work, the visualizations, the charts, all the methodical data-driven work research he had done on Black Americans at the time, which created the foundation for the sociology field. But yeah.
Right. And I would be amiss if I did not mention that he founded the sociology department at that great institution called Clark Atlanta University, which happens to be the school that I went to. Here.
So will be the space for the first Black speculative fiction convention that happened.
Yeah. which I was coming out of, I was returning. I was at an interesting juncture in my life in school then. One of my professors actually put that conference together. And I realized that many years later.
Which one?
Now you're going to get me in trouble.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I know I can go look it up because they are really pioneers in creating that space, that work. And so many other scholars have been writing about Black speculative fiction. But it's just this sense in the publishing industry itself, there was an ideal that we weren't really a part of the genre.
Right. And your anthology was the first major anthology of Black science fiction Afrofuturist works. It was certainly the first, definitely I remember seeing that book in the bookstore and saying, wow, I didn't realize there was so much science fiction, Black science fiction writing. I saw it as I was coming out of school, and I'm looking like, of course, I didn't know you at the time, but that book was a big deal. And it really, in my opinion, became a turning point for Afrofuturism and for people feeling more comfortable in being able to write, pulling from these, realizing that there was a foundation in speculative thought that didn't always fall in these quote unquote mainstream discussions of what science fiction was. Um, so it's when you put the story in there and people are reading W.E.B. Du Bois's work in the context of science fiction, what was the reaction?
I mean, they were astonished. They were excited. It gave us another perspective on somebody that we already respected and loved, right? And admire, and to think that the creativity that he had, like I said, he wrote in so many different genres, right? And just let you know, he had a very lively mind. He was a thinker and a creator. And writers just write, right? Writers, we write. We write. If something, if the spirit moves you and you end up, a melody doesn't leave and you write a song, you're not going to not write it, because I usually write short stories, or I usually write, etc. You're going to write. If the spirit moves you and you have something to say about the world today, right? Which is what Nina Simone said, we should be writing, our art should speak to the present, world that we're observing, and the struggles that we see, right? And Bell Hooks reminded us that we should also write about what's possible, right? Not just what is, but what is possible. Then when you think about it that way, it's not surprising that a person like Alice Walker would not only write The Third Life of Grange Copeland, or write The Secret to Possessing Joy, or That Color Purple, but would also be the person to write a beautiful essay about the work of Zora Neale Hurston, right? Or writing any number of essays, or writing nonfiction and writing poetry. Writers write. Tony K. Bombara write. When I think about Ishmael Reed, who is also Amiri Baraka, these are also writers I included in Dark Matter. They are creators that we normally think of in other genres or other areas of literature. And for me, it was very important to show that Black speculative writing, the tradition of our writing, is going to appear in places that maybe the canon hasn't observed yet, or hasn't been accustomed to thinking of us. And as Black people in this country, and I would say throughout the diaspora, we have to be resourceful and creative. We get in where we fit in, as we say in the South. You get in where you fit in, right? And we create the spaces, and oftentimes that's going to be in the underground. It's going to be in the liminal spaces. It's going to be in the between, as Tangana Reeve wrote in her very first novel, The Between. And so if you're looking to track our creative thinking and our critical thinking and analysis, you're going to have to look outside the box for that.
That's a very good point. I think one of the things that I identify with W.E.B. Du Bois in it with respect to his process is that the fact we know him for his theory work. But he clearly turned to writing science fiction and other sort of pieces as well. And as a person who writes theory, and I also do creative work, I understand how sometimes you're working through these ideas in a creative space, or even as a sense of release. You're dealing with this really intense subject matter of trying to educate and lower barriers, and you need a kind of release creatively. And I could see, but because both of those processes for me work hand in hand, it gave me a new insight into W.E.B. Du Bois as a human being, or as an artist, or as a creative. A man who's both sociologist, he's writing theory, he's writing creative works, he's putting together installations and showcases and starting record labels, and working on so many different sides of an issue, not to mention even, talk about prolific. W.B. Du Bois almost lived for 100 years, and in his later years lived in Ghana. Even in the 2 years he was in Ghana, he wrote the national histories of 6 African nations. before he passed away, he wanted to write a book on every single African nation. I mean, this is a man, doing this intense work um, throughout his life. And there's a kind of joy that I find in knowing that he had moments to write creatively and in the midst of everything that he was doing.
He not only was prolific, as you said, and constantly thinking about our history, our place in the world, and how do you give voice to the silence? How do you make visible the invisible, right? How do you change the narratives, right? But he wasn't also working in isolation. He was in a community, a constant community of conversation with contemporaries, like Pauline E. Hopkins, who's also is one of the proto science fiction writers in Black speculative fiction. He was in dialogue with Booker T. Washington, and obviously had great disagreement with Marcus Garvey, but of course went full circle in his life and ended up becoming a Pan-Africanist and leaving America and spending his 90s, his last years, after having been in France and leaving, going to Ghana, which is where he died. And I know you visited his center.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So you got to see the last things that he was working on when he passed. So he wasn't done. He hadn't retired, right? He was still thinking about us and thinking about us in connection to Africa and the larger independence movements that were springing up there. And it just reminds me that when we're thinking about the tradition of Black letters, it is very important that we have a very nuanced and gracious and fluid way of thinking about it. Because, as you said, all of these people that we admire so much, they were human and they were being impacted in so many different ways by not only the questions of the day, which is consistent in his fiction writing, the questions that W.E. Du Bois had, that were also being played out in his nonfiction, right? So, and that's the power of art. You can take a question that you might approach differently in science, right? And you are not limited by what is real or what we agree is real and what are the laws of physics and what are the laws of the current society that we live in. And you can use your imagination and push past those boundaries and take us somewhere else to explore those questions and maybe possibly come up with other possibilities, other answers. That's the fun of being a speculative fiction writer. All writers speculate, all artists ask the question. A painter may say, what if I take these two shades and blend it together? What if I'm a found artist? What if I take these pieces of garbage that people think are garbage and recreate it into something new? I think about the work of Betty Saar, right? And her daughters, right? Allison and Lisa. Leslie, excuse me, how they take found art and create something new out of it. They're always asking, what if, right? Bisa Butler, the wonderful quilter. What if I take these photographs or these images of Black life, Black culture, and I reimagine them with Ankara, with these beautiful African fabrics and patterns and create, a different way of thinking about quilts. The G's Benz quilters, we're always thinking past the norm. And with creative writers, with speculative fiction writers in particular, you ask the question, what if, but the answers are only limited by your imagination, right? Mm-hmm. And out of that, so much new stuff happens. So I think the Comet in particular is an important work to look at. I'm excited to see how Tim Fielder is dramatizing it for us, visualizing it for us. I think about other possible mediums that might have been inspired by W.E. Du Bois's The Comet. There was a film that the great Harry Belafonte appeared in, and I think it was The World, the Devil and the Flesh. Mm. And to me, it seemed like it was inspired by The Comet. Others think it might have been M.P. Shill's The Purple Cloud, but it's more aligned with W.E. Du Bois's the Comet story. And it would have been a work that they probably wouldn't have felt the need to credit anyway, right? Because so much of our creativity, our early creativity, was not credited to us, including our inventions, a lot of them, etc. But when you dig through and you realize, okay, who actually created Jack Daniel's recipe? We found out it's a whole nother brother, right?
Right.
So we're constantly exploring it and finding out more about Black American contributions to American society and to the world. And the Comet is just another example of that. When I read the Comet, I also read Jesus Christ in Texas, right? Which was another speculative fiction story I included in the first Dark Matter. Maybe I put it in the second one. I think I might have put it in the second one. But I wasn't surprised that he had written that story as well, because it's very much in the same wheelhouse, right, for him. If Jesus comes back to Texas, what are they going to do when they see him and they find out he's a Black man? It's not a good answer, right?
It's fascinating because we talk about Martin Luther King and the role he played in encouraging Nichelle Nichols to stay in Star Trek, and the impact that had on even women deciding to be a part of NASA, right? And then I look at the fact that you have another titan of a figure, W.E.B. Du Bois, who also wrote science fiction. Here's someone who was talking about theories around the color line and the talented tint that still play a role in how we think of Black identity a century later. And he too was doing his explorations of science fiction. And as you're well aware of the short story, The Princess Steel, that's now being described as a fantasy story. So I think, Sheree, you highlighting the Comet probably, laid some grounds for people looking or uncovering some of his other work and realizing that they were genre pieces as well. And The Princess Steel, of course, deals with this.
Saw those works before, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I said, people saw these works before, but because there's such a particular perspective when it comes to science fiction and fantasy, it's not always examined with the same type of seriousness and giving it the value that it should have, right? Because it's not like they didn't know those work. The work was published, right, and it was in print.
Right, it was out there, and
Yeah.
people saw it. People who knew his work,
buy it and put it on my shelf, right? But it
right,
wasn't being discussed. And the thing about the Princess Steel, keep in mind, he was good friends with Pauline E. Hopkins, and that's Pauline E. Hopkins' wheelhouse. That kind of story, right?
Oh, I
Where
didn't
you
realize
are,
that.
yeah, like her works, to me seem to suggest that there is a much that African Americans can gain from exploring their relationship and connection to Africa and to African history and African cultures, right? And so when you have this kind of lost world, lost civilization stories that were very popular in the early 20th century, right? And the late 19th century, you have her writing stories in which an African American is on a journey or on a quest for something and finds value or finds new information and new insight, being in an African context, being in Africa and discovering or being a part of an existing African civilization. And this is at a time when, of course, all the propaganda that we're getting from America and from the Hollywood system, the same Hollywood system that criminalized and degraded voodooing as a spiritual and religious practice, is the same propaganda machine that's telling us that we as Black people are buffoons and minstrelsy um, figures, right? And so Pauline E. Hopkins is writing stories that challenge that, and they were in conversation.
Well, I guess that makes sense because she was a playwright. She was in the Boston area, as was, W.E.B. Du Bois was from the Massachusetts area. And just so that our audience knows, she wrote the book, what became a book of One Blood, that was initially a series that ran in the Colored American. Very fascinating. And and even I grew up in a New Thought metaphysics. And when I was reading her work, I could tell that she was familiar with a lot of those writings in that period. But that's the sort of thing, again, you have to, if you're not reading these stories, being open to these other interpretations and context, you can't frame them in the way that you did with W.E.B. Du Bois's The Comet. And so to that, I have to give you a big cheers for being bold enough to frame the comet in that way and inspire as many people as you have. Because now, whenever we talk about Afrofuturism or Black people writing science fiction and visionaries, clearly W.E.B. Du Bois is a visionary, but we can also talk about him as a science fiction writer, something we would not be doing if you had not included his work in that anthology.
And easy to include in there because there were Black writers who had written earlier than him, had published earlier than him, like Martin Delany, who's the father of Black nationalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who actually knew of his African heritage from his his parents knew their parents. He knew their names and their tribe, right? And so he was, trying to think about these things in, I guess, the mid 1850s, right? And serially publishing his work in the Black press. The Black press was so important to our lives and our history making and the records, the archives of it. What remains of the Black press today is so critical, because mm-hmm. if you don't have these countering voices, these countering publications, and I'm not speaking of the ones that are just aggregates of whatever else is being published and they just copy that and put a few ads in and a few cotillions and in sorority and fraternity activities, but I mean the ones that are actually still actively doing investigative reporting and keeping track of what's happening to us as a community. Those spaces for journalism and those spaces for creativity are so important.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, you have Martin R. Delaney's work, and he's not related to Samuel R. Delany, though I don't think it's so interesting that another brilliant Delany family member, surname, excuse me, and also Sydney Griggs, who had roots in Memphis as well, who's a preacher here in Memphis. Sydney Griggs was publishing his proto-speculative fiction work and self-published it in 1890.
So right. W.E.B. Du Bois was, in that sense, not alone, but certainly part of a tradition of activist-minded Black Americans, African Americans, who were writing speculative fiction while doing the theory and the real ground-building work around creating equity in this country. I think that's a very profound connection that you're making. And
I just want to say, as an editor, it was easier for me to reprint W.E.B. Du Bois's story because it was a standalone story that had a clear arc that was wonderfully written, and that you could, it really resonated as a story. And the others were from larger novels written in the traditional 19th century way. So those were harder to excerpt. And so I chose not to.
That's a good point, because he did write with a kind of clarity that was mm-hmm. not typical of the time. When I was a kid, I used to call it flowery writing.
Yeah.
Right. Highly decorated prose. But he did have a sort of crispness in the style that was very contemporary. So here's something funny too, right? So we're talking about this short story and, of course, the profound dynamics of just the arc and the subject matter, but the writing itself was stellar. Um, and I've read Dark Water before. And Dark Water, of course, is the book that the short story was a part of. And it's kind of an unusual kind of book. I mean, he has um, essays about his life in there. He has some theory pieces in there. He has some critiques. And then you have the short story. um, and it's a different kind of book, I think. It's something that I guess today you might almost call it mixed media, or mixed genre sort of writing. And he was putting that sort of book out at the turn of the century, very sort of futuristic way of even doing a book today. I mean, even today, you don't have a lot of books that mix that many different styles of writing in one piece. So I think that's something to, which, of course, shows his brilliance, and then shows your brilliance as well for being able to pluck that story and include it in this larger body of work. I'm wondering, as we, look to unfortunately bring our fantastic conversation to a close, I'm wondering, what do you feel the impact his of W.E.B. Du Bois being viewed as a science fiction writer, or the impact of the comet itself has had on how people talk about science fiction, or how they talk about Afrofuturism or beyond?
I just love the National Black Arts Festivals, their 35th year. They had a blacklisted banned books panel that we did in Atlanta. And it was probably it's the second banned books discussion I've had for Black History Month. It was for Black History Month. And the thing that I'm struck by is that our work is constantly under this lens, right? Under this critical lens in which it is treated as if it is dangerous, right? Dangerous work. And it challenges a lot of the political and social structure that America has fought tooth and nail to retain, I'll say. It's not an accident that we're still asking the same questions that W. Du Bois was asking in the last century, right? And I think that as long as these kind of revolutionary voices and writers are daring to write their work and to publish it, whether it's independently or whether it's through the mainstream or what have you, the impact is going to be that it's going to inspire other people, other thinkers, to question the things that are treated as normal in our societies. It's going to encourage people to continuously challenge the narratives that have been laid out to us as this is the history, and this is the reason why things are the way they are. And it's going to challenge us to create a better society which honors what America claims it was supposed to be in the first place, right? And that's what speculative fiction can do. That's what Afrofuturism can do. That's what African futurism can do. It is not only a place for play and exploration and entertainment and just free imagining, but it's also a possible place and a space for liberation. The impact of the comet for me is that it expanded the ideal of what science fiction could be. We already know, people who already love the genre already know how powerful it is. And we know that we're actually living in a very science fictional world that writers imagined, decades ago, right? Or a century ago, right? Some of the innovations that we have are created by people who love science fiction and say, hey, I'm going to create an MP3 player. I'm going to create a cell phone. I'm going to create a drone. I just found out a Black man created the original drone, right? From LA, and it's not a black and white picture. It's like he's dressed like one of my uncles from the 70s, with his drone. I was like, what? Or that the third rail was, created for subways was created by Black people. So it's all these imaginings that things that are created on the page can inspire actual change in the world. And that's why they want to ban some of this writing. They want to ban it because it does change the way people think and about certain topics and certain things and the way they envision themselves in the world. And W.E. Du Bois, as well as so many other Black science fiction writers, have always wanted us to imagine ourselves beyond the pages of what other people would write for us. They want us to imagine ourselves as full human beings, you know, with all the possibility that means. And so the impact not only creates more interest and legitimacy for science fiction, it shows us that it can be a powerful educational tool, not just for graduate students and academics and scholars, but also for reluctant readers, right? Imagine being told that you have to read the Souls of Black Folk, right? You're reading that, you're getting all the historical information out of it, but also being given the Comet or Jesus Christ in Texas in a religion, a Western civilization class, a philosophy class, given that text, or being given the Princess Steel, right, in an African studies class or an economics class, even, right? And thinking about the impact that it will have on the thing that you're studying and the way you see yourself in the world. So the impact, I think, has been very powerful. I think it's going to continue more with Tim Fielder's graphic novel. I think it's already, John Jennings' graphic novel has already, I mean, his imprint has already had such an important impact on readers. And it will continue to go around the world, and maybe we'll find more stories from other writers that we didn't know were also dreaming of futures not yet, not yet imagined. Who knows,
Right. No, that's a fascinating speculation to go back and think about people who are here today and in yesteryear. All our activists and great minds and their secret science fiction stash.
I don't know. I keep thinking about some of the from some of the Negro spirituals and some of the music. It's always has this wistful, carry me away, let me escape this hell that we're living in right now in society, but also this hope that, as they say, trouble don't last always, right? Trouble doesn't last always, and that there are higher forces that are moving in around us, and that they can imagine a different future, right? Yeah. And so even if you're only just going to think about the first slave narratives and the autobiographies that were being written, and you think about a person like Harriet Jacobs, right, who had to spend years in the attic to get free, they had the hope that they were going to survive, right? They had a hope, they imagined themselves in these other spaces. And so part of our lives in this country in particular has always, to me, had a speculative element to it, because we're still here and we're still fighting. And there are people who are extinct who no longer exist. And we're not one of those groups. We're still fighting. And I think our art, our music, our song, our dance, our rhythms, our writing, our stories, even the oral stories, right, are part of that sword and shield that protected us, to protected that humanity in us, to keep going forward. And so it's our work is to honor those traditions, to honor those pioneers, and to keep doing the excavation and finding those new stories and supporting the new voices and new writers who are building on those traditions and creating new things that we can't even imagine today. It's like a very exciting time. Delaney, Griggs, Hopkins, Du Bois, they're not the only ones, there's so many now that who knows what the future is going to have, what other stories will be there for us. But the comment is is amazing. I mean, we didn't get to talk about who was it in the comment, but we're because that's something I'm so fascinated by.
Wait, what do you mean?
I mean, where's the Black family in the world, right? Like if you're doing like a book club study of the story, there are some spaces and some absences and some things that we can talk about. Like my first thing is not going to be go running looking for someone else. I'm going to be looking for my family. I'm going to be looking for my husband. I'm going to look for my children. I'm going to be looking for my brothers. I'm going to be looking for my parents. I'm going to be looking for my family, right? In the rubble. I'm going to be digging through the rubble looking for them. And this man is out here like, woo, where's Becky? I mean, come on.
Well, he is very happy to be able to dine in the fine restaurants, walk the streets. He can walk.
I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but yeah, it coming out of reading all these amazing Black writers. I just found that so interesting.
Right, yeah. That is an interesting point. Where were they? And it's again, there could be of what we know about W.E.B. Du Bois. Clearly he was a man who had a quest for a specific kind of freedom, and part of that was enjoying the finer things, or being to go places and do things that others could not do. He's someone who could go places and do things that others could not do, and had a closer proximity to whatever those barriers were in quote unquote finer circles than maybe some others at that time. So there could be a bit of reflecting on that. Clearly, I'm reading into his work. Who knows the context under which he wrote that story? What was going on in his life at the time.
It's just so interesting to me. But I really love the larger message that I was able to pull out of it. And I know each reader is going to take something differently from the fiction and the stories that they read, because we bring so much of ourselves to it as well, right?
That's very true.
But I was thinking about this whole ideal that, yes, the racism that we deal with on a daily basis or a systemic basis is structural, right? It's structural. It is something that's created. And if certain factors happen in which the whole system is removed, what do we revert back to? Who are we? How do we move through space? How do we organize our communities? How do we take care of each other or not? You know what I mean? Without those old legacies being so present. And, and that's one of the questions of a lot of dystopian science fiction and fantasy.
I mean, when I read the story, I thought it was kind of sad, actually. I mean, I was happy to be reading something that Du Bois wrote. Yeah, I thought it was pretty sad. I was like, man,
the hope that they find it in it, but I mean, there are optimists among us. So.
Yeah, I was like, I like the genius of the story. But I was like, man, could you have given it a different ending, a different sort of? And what would that have looked like?
Where's the Black community? Where are we? And he's in Harlem. I thought it was in Harlem. I mean, I imagine him being in Harlem because at the time when I was editing Dark Matter, I was in Harlem. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, he could have created something like Pauline Hopkins, where he uncovers some secret world of technologically advanced Black people, or maybe he could have lived his days as this single guy, going about town, him and this lady. Like, it's interesting that he described it all as so fleeting. As opposed to just building this whole wondrous piece.
yeah. They had about 2 seconds, right? About 2 seconds before reality crept back in. And it makes me think about that wonderful Twilight Zone episode with Meredith Burgess. Is that his name? The actor, where he's I think he's a librarian, or anyway, he loves reading more than anything in the world. And like the world kind of ends and everything's all messed up, and he realizes he's stuck in the library in the basement with all these beautiful books. And he's all excited because now he can spend the rest of his life just reading peacefully and not having to deal with other humans. And his glasses break.
Oh, that was a
He's
rough
just like,
one.
oh, it's like one of my favorite Twilight Zones. And it makes me think a little bit of the Comet. Um, because right before they are just like, okay, we're gonna make it work, we're gonna figure out how to survive, we're gonna, keep going, and I don't know, reseed the earth. I don't know what they were, what we're supposed to take from it. Then suddenly here comes the lynch mob or whatever, the regular group, and it's a wrap. So yeah.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder to what extent it paralleled his life, right? Ah, it makes you wonder to what extent it paralleled his life. When was he meeting these people, and was he having interactions where he felt very accepted and then felt very rejected?
Yeah, they created the NAACP, but they weren't allowed to be a part of the sister organization, so it was still very much segregated,
Right. And
and
then
it,
the story came out, was it 1920?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I
So,
don't know
I
when
mean,
he wrote it though, so but it was published in 1920. Yeah, so
right. Yeah, I mean, so that's pretty fascinating. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share about this wonderful story, and how it's just impacted you over the years?
um, we're just so honored that dark matter is still being read and taught. That these writers trusted me with their work at the time. I didn't have any real footprint in publishing. Um, so to have Octavia E. Butler and to have Ishmael Reed and Amira Baraka and Wanda Coleman, Jewel Gomez, all these amazing people trust me with their work. Walter Mosley. It was very life changing. It was very powerful. A lot of these writers have gone on to continue to contribute amazing things to the field. They are dominating the field. Nalo Hopkinson, Nisi Shaw, Nadia Okorafor. I mean, there's just, it hasn't stopped. And to see so many other audiences embracing speculative fiction, particularly Black speculative fiction as a genre in so many different mediums has been very gratifying because, you and I have lived long enough to know when being a nerd wasn't cool.
Mm-hmm.
It was the butt of the joke in the movies, and people were hiding their comic books, or their Dungeons and Dragons, characters and everything. And to see it to be such a mainstream thing now, where there are adaptation after adaptation, whether it's films and movies or limited series, episodes, TV shows, it's been great. And one of the things I do remember is Octavia Butler telling me when she agreed to be a part of Dark Matter that she had tried to do a Black anthology some years ago with Martin Greenberg, the editor, and that they didn't find anyone to support it because people at the time in publishing thought it would be all about race and that no one would want to read about it, and so they didn't do it. And I just when she told me that really emboldened me and really made me realize how important and significant a collection like Dark Matter could be in terms of changing the dynamics in our industry. And so it's been really lovely to witness that.
Right. What an amazing conversation to have with the Octavia Butler. And here you are achieving something that she was not able to. And she graciously contributed to it. Well, Sheree, I think you're awesome. And now our grand audience here knows that you're awesome as well. I hope that everyone who's uh, listening to our dialogue takes time to read The Comet. You can read it in Sheree's Dark Matter. Of course, you can read it in Dark Water. You can also look out for the adaptation that Tim Fielder is doing. And I have to give an extra plug for Dark Matter. You've been a part of a lot of anthology series, but Dark Matter really kicked it off. I think if people are looking to get a real grounding in a lot of works by many African American writers in science fiction over the course of the century, that you clearly laid the foundation for it. And I would encourage you to take a read, take a read and read that short story in its context. Another great thing that you mentioned, Sheree, was that a lot of the insights about Black culture and speculative thinking is found in quote unquote non-traditional places sometimes. So if you're doing a backward look, or even sometimes a contemporary look, you're going to see it in these journals, these anthologies. You're going to see it in series and in older newspapers, all kinds of collections and songs and artwork. But certainly, if you're looking for the literature, you're going to find it in what some would call unusual places, because Black writers had to really fight to share these perspectives, and oftentimes did so in non-traditional ways, limited edition kinds of works that were rare, and it's really worth the deep dive to get some insight, particularly because I find a lot of people who are doing deep dives into Black life are looking more to the nonfiction and not the fiction. And there's a lot of insight that you can gain into Black culture through the fiction and clearly the speculative fiction as well. So
that also, when we create things, and this, having edited the Afrofuturism volume, that when we create things, we may create it for us, for our liberation, for our entertainment, for our enjoyment, but we're never unobserved. And it always has an impact outside of ourselves. And when I think about W.E. Du Bois's pioneering work, he created the sociology field, and that's something that people around the world have been able to partake in and add and contribute to and build right upon. And I think about the stories that are included in the Dark Matter volumes, not just Dark Matter, a century of speculative fiction from the African diaspora, but Dark Matter, Reading the Bones, which I did a few years after the first Dark Matter. That opened up the door for other communities to do whole volumes of their short fiction, other communities that had not had anthologies of short fiction in that way, created and edited by them, right? So you can go read whole volumes of Mexican science fiction. You can go read South Asian science fiction. You can read Caribbean science fiction. You can read all kinds of work from particular communities that were underrepresented in our genre, and that came out of the Dark Matter anthologies as well. So
that is so exciting. So everyone, please be sure to check out Dark Matter in addition to all of Sheree's other works. If you want to check out my works, you can look at Afrofuturism, the world of Black sci-fi and fantasy culture, also Black Panther, is a cultural exploration. And if you're in Chicagoland, you can check out Naya and the Multiverse currently at the Adler Planetarium. But before you do that, you must check out Sheree's Dark Matter.
And shout out to the Schomburg, because the Schomburg was my office away from home. Deep dives of their archives. The Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture was a very special space for me. I remember going in there and also seeing an exhibit of Tom Fillings' passage work, which Tom Fillings also had done speculative work, comics and things like that. So it was just in a very major space for me to do my thinking and planning and editing of Dark Matter. So shout out.
How lovely was that, doing your writing and research in the Schomburg? This is so storied. No, that's really exciting. And of course, the Schomburg has a annual Afrofuturism Black Comics Festival con called, I guess, the Schomburg Black Comics Con, something comparable to that. It's fantastic though, so be on the lookout.
almost like a decade. Has it been a decade already?
I think it's been a decade. John Jennings was one of the founders. I had the opportunity to present last year, as did Tim actually. And now when you go to the Schomburg, you could say greats like Sheree Renée Thomas was there researching the dark matter.
I know. I just keep thinking about like all of these different amazing writers that I got to meet through doing editing matter, and people I already loved and admire. I mean, like you could have knocked me over with a feather. When Ishmael Reed and Amira Baraka accepted my invitation, I was just like,
I mean, you had some serious heavy hitters. I mean, you know, our focus here was on W.E.B. Du Bois, but good grief, Ishmael Reed and
but I'm just thinking like
Butler.
Seeds that really helped with dark matter that I think planted the seeds. Obviously, I'm from Memphis, so this is the place of all the places. We're at the crossroads of Black culture. But I think about a collection called Black Erotica or Erotique Noir that was edited.
Came out around the same time.
It came out earlier because I remember standing in line at a bookstore, at an independent Black bookstore, to get my book signed by the late Dr. Reginald Martin, who taught at University of Memphis for many years, and the wonderful scholar Mira DeCosta Willis, who's very important to us, who edited the diaries of Ida B. Wells. You know, and Ida B. Wells, of course, was a great contemporary friend of W. Du Bois and helped co-found the NAACP, though they don't usually say that, but she did. Those were planting seeds. And also a collection that Herb Boyd edited called Brother Man was important. I think an important seed for me as well, and thinking about, and Herb Boyd, of course, is the fantastic writer and journalist from the Amsterdam News and has done many things. It was a part of the Afrofuturism book that you all did. So to me, it's like everything went full circle. Yeah. So it's important for us to have a very expansive point of view when you're looking at Black arts and letters. I'll just say that.
Right. And I think your work shows, the anthologies you do, but I would say all of your work, but certainly anthologies show that these ideas come from not just solitary contemplations, but through being in community.
Yes.
And, you know, there's a joy, as we mentioned, in reading the Comet by itself, but reading the Comet in the midst of these other short stories by people who were, many of whom building off of his theoretical work, certainly benefiting by it in their personal and professional lives, I would say is a true joy. So with that, I want to say thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sheree, for being here and gracing us with the insights, never before told information on dark.
It's an honor to be in conversation with you. Yes.
Yay. Thank you. And thank you to Tim Felder for bringing us together in the celebration of his upcoming adaptation of the Comet. Thank you, Carnegie Hall, for being fantastic and letting us share with you as well. We're going to do a big wave to our Carnegie Hall family and all who are out there. Don't forget to check out Sheree's first anthology, Dark Matter, and read The Comet. We will speak with you soon.